If everything you know about the United States Cavalry comes from John Wayne movies, you might want to visit the latest exhibit at Jefferson Barracks. It traces the history of the cavalry and its forerunner, the Dragoons. Museum curator Daniel Gonzales is our guide for the exhibit, which runs through December 28th.
You have this evolution of United States cavalry throughout the 19th century. And at all of these different moments, you see that Jefferson Barracks is not only connected to that, but it really finds itself at the heart of that story. You have a lot of these bigger-than-life names in American history that find themselves tied to Jefferson Barracks and the cavalry here. You've got guys like Robert E. Lee, Jefferson Davis, Nathan Boone, who's Daniel Boone's son. But the biggest contributions are really from folks whose names we've forgotten a long time ago, that this is a story of the rank and file cavalry soldier. These are the guys who got paid $7 to $13 a month, who took a job with low pay on the edge of the frontier that was incredibly dangerous, but in the end had a huge impact in this story of westward expansion. In 1878, Jefferson Barracks becomes the cavalry recruit depot for the entire United States Army. And so what that means is that every recruit, almost without exception, who joins the United States Cavalry in those years has to pass through Jefferson Barracks in order to get their initial training. They would spend between a month and 3 months here at the post. And they would get their equipment, they would go through physical training, and they would learn some of the horse technique, some of the fighting technique that they would need further west. It was a relatively short amount of time to get all that training in, but they did what they could. Just to give you an idea of how broadly these troops are being distributed across the West, I have this image. I picked 1886. Now, 1886 was not an especially busy year for Jefferson Barracks. We picked it because it was really exemplary of any year that you might have looked at. It was an average year. But between January and December of 1886, you can see that troops from Jefferson Barracks are being distributed all across the West to different locations, north, south, and all the way almost to the coast. Every cavalry regiment would have to return to Jefferson Barracks in order to get re-equipped, in order to get restaffed. They would have to begin their life here. They would go back and forth between this place as kind of the center of gravity for their experience. This uniform is an undress uniform that would have been worn by the United States Dragoons organized here in 1833. And the uniform it takes on the color that would be defining for the cavalry, this blue and yellow. It's also accompanied with this white buff leather belt. It ends up being a really colorful, a really bright uniform, and that was in part intentional. This unit was given the task of patrolling a huge portion of the frontier, and there were only 500 of them initially. And so, unlike later, where units would operate in small companies, detached units all across the West, these guys wanted to be intimidating. They operated together as a regiment. The next uniform we have here is typical of what you would have seen worn by the 1st and 2nd Cavalry. These units were created in 1855, and they were the first units that were designated United States Cavalry. The uniform is very similar to what you would see if you saw images of the Civil War. If you saw reenactors, they would be wearing a uniform very similar. What we have here is a saddle that they would have ridden during the Mexican War in the 1840s. The saddle is called a Grimsley saddle, and it gets that name from its designer, Thornton Grimsley. Thornton Grimsley was a St. Louis-based saddle maker, and you can see that this is just another example of the central nature of St. Louis and of Jefferson Barracks in the story of the cavalry, that when they decided that they were going to adopt a new cavalry saddle, well, where did they go? They went to where all of these cavalry troops, the rank and file men, were located, here in St. Louis. The cavalry soldier is going to carry 2 guns with him. He's going to carry a carbine rifle and a pistol. So the carbines that you see on the back of this case, starting at the bottom, are an 1840s model that would have been carried by Dragoons, starting with the 2nd Dragoons operating against Seminole Indians in Florida. The middle weapon is an 1870s model Springfield carbine, a trapdoor rifle. Would have been used during the Indian Wars between 1866 and 1890. At the very top, you have the Craig Jorgensen carbine. This is a weapon that you're going to be seeing cavalry troopers carrying during the Spanish-American War. On the deck here, the base of the case, we have 3 pistols. The very back one is a smoothbore 1840s pistol, would have been carried by dragoon regiments who were fighting during the Mexican War. So the 1840 smoothbore pistol was a muzzle-loading weapon. When you're on horseback, you're really going to get one shot because reloading it while you're on horseback is not feasible. On the front here, you have an 1851 model Colt revolver. And on the other side is an 1870s Colt revolver. During the Civil War, 10% of the Union Army is made up of African American troops. When the war ends, African American service continues. And in 1866, several all African American units are added to the United States military, the regular army. 2 of those units were cavalry, the 9th and the 10th Cavalry. Now those units were organized elsewhere, but they had early connections to Jefferson Barracks. The 10th Cavalry had their earliest recruits sent here to Jefferson Barracks before being sent on to their former organization site. And the 9th Cavalry actually made its headquarters here in 1870. Now these African American troops served honorably in the West. Their rates of re-enlistment were the highest in the United States military, and their rates of desertion were the lowest. So we began our story about the United States Cavalry by talking about its birth in 1833 here at Jefferson Barracks. We'd like to conclude it by talking about an event that foreshadows the end of the horse cavalry. In 1897, you have an experiment that an African-American infantry unit takes part in. They're stationed at Fort Missoula in Montana, and they're given the task of testing out whether bicycles are a viable way of transporting troops. So they're told they have to ride their bicycles from Fort Missoula to Jefferson Barracks in Missouri. This is a ride of almost 2,000 miles. There's no roads in many cases. This is a cross-country trek that they're being asked to take. And they do it successfully, although they do ultimately decide that bicycles are not going to be the best tool for the United States military. However, this does foreshadow the fact that increasing technology and mechanization is going to spell the end for the horse cavalry. The story of the United States Cavalry is tied so deeply to Jefferson Barracks. From the 1833 establishment of the United States Dragoons, to the 1878 establishment of the United States Cavalry Recruit Depot here, to the creation of the Buffalo Soldier, the first African-American units in the United States military, on to the 1904 World's Fair and the Spanish-American War. Jefferson Barracks, in all of these moments, finds itself tied directly into the story of the United States Cavalry, and as such, tied directly into the story of westward expansion and the story of the United States. It's a special story that I think St. Louisans and Missourians have real reason to be proud of.